Start with the roll call, please. There we go.
Ms. Elliott, representing the State Treasurer. Ms. Ortega, representing the Director of Finance.
Here.
Ms. Higa.
Here.
Chairperson Rosensteel, you have a quorum.
Great, thank you very much. So let's go into the first item, which is the approval of the committee agenda. Any comments or do I hear a motion to?
Move approval of the agenda.
Moved in second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so then the approval of the minutes of our last meeting of November 4th.
I'll move approval of the minutes.
I'll just note that I think the listing of the votes didn't include me. I'm not sure why, since I was chairing the meeting and voting on all of the items. So,
Thank you, Mr. Rosensteel. The law changed early last year to require the Bagley-Keene that the minutes list the votes. We've always been in compliance with the method that we've done it. It just was harder to ferret out the information. You'd have to figure out who was on the dais at the time, compare that to who abstained or who didn't vote. And so we tried to come up with a model that was visually simple to review, and it's still a work in progress. So with your permission, if you would approve the minutes with the understanding that we will amend that section to accurately reflect that the chair had voted. In some committees that the chair doesn't vote, and so we were trying to reflect that, and I think we just had a universal approach that doesn't fit.
okay. So do you want us to take votes in a more explicit way up here?
Absolutely not. It's just the way that we record them in the minutes, that's all.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so all in favor of approval of the minutes? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Great. Minutes are approved. Our next item then is the progress on external financial auditors' report on internal control corrective actions. Larry Jensen. Morning, Larry.
Yes, good morning. This is actually a consent item. And, management continues to make good progress towards implementing the recommendations by the external financial statement auditor and for the findings that are shown in the attachments to this agenda item. Happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Seeing none. Do I hear a motion for approval?
Move approval. Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, great. So now number 4, the financial statement audit plan. So Larry and our auditors from Crow Horwath.
Yes, while they're coming up here, this is a new item that's actually on the committee's work plan for the first time that allows the opportunity for the committee as a whole to ask questions of the auditor and to learn about any changes in financial reporting requirements before the audit begins this year. CalSTR's financial statements are required to be audited annually, and currently Crow Horwath is the board's external financial statement auditor. The financial statements are prepared by management, and the role of the financial statement auditor is to express an opinion about whether these financial statements are presented fairly in all material respects. The financial statement audit will differ from one year to the next, given change in reporting requirements or changes in operations and systems that might affect financial reporting. And I'll turn the time now over to Brenda Torres, who is our signing partner on this engagement from Crow Horwath, to introduce the team and provide an overview of their client service plan for conducting the audit of this year's financial statements. Brenda.
Thank you, Larry. Good morning, Chairman Rosensteel, members of the Audits and Risk Management Committee. It's certainly a pleasure to be here this morning, and I thought this was a great idea to ask Crow to present to all of you. This will give you an opportunity if you have any questions to ask us about our overall work plan for the upcoming year. I am actually joined by Alexis Fitzpatrick to my left and Kevin Smith. They've been on the engagement for a number of years, and they're going to join me in this presentation today. We have a pretty high-level brief agenda for you. We're going to talk a little bit about the client service team, just to remind all of you, those that actually serve the CalSTRS external audit engagement. We're going to talk about our services and the related deliverables. We'll give you a high-level overview of the audit timeline. We're going to then talk to you about audit planning communications. That's probably where we're going to spend the most part of our time this morning with you. And then we're going to do an overview of new accounting standards, primarily focused on GASB 72. We've left some time for questions and answers, but per usual, if you have any questions as they arise, please feel free to interrupt, and we'd be happy to answer them at that time. So we certainly have had the pleasure of having staff continuity on the particular engagement, so I will recur as the signing partner. Kevin will remain in his role as the engagement partner. Really, he is our GASB expert on the team, if you will. Chris Moore, who's not here with us today, he is Crow's internal valuation expert when it comes to valuing securities. So Chris will remain a member of the team. And then Craig Sullivan, he's our IT risk partner. So he leads that portion of the overall audit engagement. Fortunately, as partners, we are leveraged with respect to our model. We have a number of senior managers. So Alexis is probably one of the most important key components of our team. She is our overall project manager. She is here on site most of the time. She has oversight of all aspects of the engagement, if you will, and then really focuses on financial reporting matters. Ron Gasink was added last year. Ron leads the execution of the employer audits, so he was new to the team due to the implementation of GASB 67, and he will recur in that role again this year. In addition to that, we have Mike Van Dyne and Dan O'Malley. They focus on auditing primarily related to the investment portfolio. They have deep expertise in that particular area. And when you think about the size of the portfolio, the complexity of some of the investments, and the diversity in that portfolio, we want to make sure we have a really good team to look at that. Rich Perilou actually works under Craig as it relates to the financially significant systems, or the IT component of the audit. And then we have various team members that supplement us in each of those particular areas. When we talk about the deliverables, I think Larry did a really nice job of giving an overview of the financial statements. But again, the financial statements are prepared by management. And we will report on the financial statements as well as this supplementary information that you can see here, the administrative expenses, the schedule of investment expenses, and the consultants and professional services expenses as well. In addition to that, there are also some additional items that are included within the report. And we do perform some specified procedures over each of the required supplementary information. So that would be the MD&A, or management's discussion and analysis. And then each of the following schedules: the changes in the net pension liability, the schedule of net pension liability, the schedule of contributions, the schedule of the money-weighted investment returns, and then the schedule of the funding progress. So those will all be a part of the deliverables that we provide to you and covered by our opinion. In addition to that, a little bit outside the scope of that particular audit, if you will, you might recall with the implementation of GASB 67 and primarily with GASB 68 for the employers or the non-employer contributing entity, management has engaged us to also perform an audit on the schedule of proportionate share of contributions for employers and the non-contributing or the non-employer contributing entity, as well as specified captions on the schedule of aggregate pension amounts. In addition to our independent auditors' reports, there are required communications to those charged with governance, which is all of you, so we will cover that with you in November. Certain required communications Alexis will actually go over today, which are those required communications that are at the front end or in the planning stage of the particular audit. We will also issue a report on internal control as it relates to financial reporting and compliance on other matters based on the financial statement audit. We're not actually issuing an opinion, if you will, but just a report on our procedures. We will issue a management comment letter, and then again, we'll issue the independent auditor's report and our opinions on the special purpose audits, if you will. The overall audit timeline, so we constantly work on the CalSTRS audit engagement, so we're already planning for the next fiscal year before we actually issue our opinion on the CAFR, which is typically in December. So if you recall last year, we met with you in November to present the prior year results, and at that point in time, we're already planning for the current fiscal year audit. We have typically been out here in February conducting a lot of the interviews that we have with executive management, as well as many of you, to get your planning considerations and make fraud inquiries. Interim fieldwork really begins in March, where we really focus on beginning the employer audits. So we'll have a team that will work on the employer audits. And then in addition to that, we'll kind of kick off the year in fieldwork, if you will, by going over the overall audit timeline with the remainder of management. We'll have a kickoff meeting in March. And then the on-site interim fieldwork will come out here in April. The IT component of our audit, that will continue in May when the interim financial statements are prepared by management, which are typically provided to us in May. Will come out at the very end of May and for a few weeks in June. And then year-end fieldwork begins approximately mid-August and goes until we issue. We typically deliver in October and then present to all of you in November, all of the deliverables that I discussed previously. And with that, I'll pause before Alexis gets into really what's the meat of our presentation and see if you have any questions. Okay, Alexis, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Brenda. As Brenda mentioned, there are certain items that are required that we communicate with those charged with governance, and I'm going to go over those items. In particular is the communication we have with the committee, and we believe that an effective two-way communication really is critical in the planning of the audit. We have scheduled, as Brenda has mentioned, and one-on-one meetings with the committee members as well as executive management this week. And for those that we can't meet, we'll either have a call or schedule a meeting the next time we're on site. But those meetings really provide a lot of insight as to the changes that are going on in the organization. It helps build our expectations for the audit, as well as any concerns that any one of you have or executive management has. So that is a really critical component of the planning process. We'll discuss things regarding your oversight of the internal controls at the organization, if there's any detection of fraud. So we'll have those fraud inquiries. And then also just open up the communication if there's anything else that we should be aware of in performing the audit and making sure we're meeting everybody's expectations. We also wanted just to communicate and reiterate the importance of an open dialogue and open communication throughout the year. So although we're meeting with each of you this week, we would hope that you'd feel comfortable in coming to us at any point in time during the engagement, during the year, if there's any concerns or anything that you would want to talk to us about, and we would give you the same back. So if there are any concerns that we have, we would also communicate with you up front. But we are required to have our year-end communication, so that usually happens in November, where we will discuss with you significant matters that occurred during the audit, or if we did identify anything such as fraud with senior management, disagreements with management, material misstatements that we identified. So all those will also be communicated at the end of the audit in November. The audit planning process, as we've mentioned, we're already starting it, and I know it seems that it's just a few months ago that we ended, but it really is a year-round process, this audit. And it starts with the communication with management as well as the committee. And from there, along with our understanding of the internal controls, we will identify the risk of error or fraud within certain account balances or key cycles, and develop a risk assessment and an approach to determine the substantive procedures that we're going to take for our audit. That includes determining inherent risk at the account level as well as control risk. So if it's a significant control that we think that we need to test, we'll go ahead and do that. The concept of materiality in planning and executing an audit, really materiality is an aggregate amount of misstatements that could be allowed, I guess you could say, until we would alter our opinion. So, and in our calculation of that materiality allowance is not only the allowance of possible misstatements that are not corrected, but also misstatements that were not identified. So we build that inherent risk into the calculation of a materiality threshold that we use throughout the audit. And in auditing to this number, we also will communicate to you at the end of the audit whether we identified any misstatements that were either significant enough to be recorded by management or insignificant in nature that they did not require recording to the financial statements, but did require communication to those charged with governance to the committee. Using the work of internal audit, we have a very close relationship with audit services in terms of communicating and making sure we are understanding the audit process that they're going through and also the audit reports that they're issuing throughout the year. So we'll review not only their internal audit reports, but the district audit reports that they issue, as well as third-party vendor reports. And in reading these reports, we get a good idea if there's risks out there that we need to be aware of, if there's been issues that have been identified that would then alter our audit procedures. And so we will be constantly getting updates of those reports and we'll review, I particularly know I review them throughout the year and making sure I can assess them continuously. Last year, audit services did provide direct assistance to Crow when it came to the GASB 68 compliance and the district audits. Something different this year is that Crow has taken on all of those audits. So audit services will not be providing direct assistance this year on the employer audits, but they will be involved and are involved heavily in the planning and kind of communication with the employer audits or the employers. And we're in that process right now. Preliminary risk assessment and audit response. The two items I want to note are really the significant unusual transactions we will look at. Those usually are significant in nature. They don't occur a lot. And so if we do identify any transaction of that nature, we will spend a lot of time there and making sure we understand what that transaction is and making sure it's appropriate. But we also spend a lot of time on significant estimates made by management. And two estimates in particular that we've also talked quite a bit about is the calculation of the total pension liability as well as fair value of hard-to-value investments. Our response to those estimates, we, at least for the total pension liability, we confirm the balance, we test the census data that is used in calculating the valuation by Milliman. We contract out with a third party, Gabriel Roeder Smith, who also validates assumptions used and the calculation of that total pension liability. We also work with management in making sure any accounting standards that come to light that would affect that valuation is being followed. For the fair value of investments, Kevin's going to touch on this a little bit regarding the implementation of GASB 72 because there is a significant amount of disclosure that's going to be required for the fair value investments. But we test the completeness and accuracy of the investment portfolio. We confirm. We look at controls surrounding fair valuing those investments already, and so that will continue as well. For that, I'd open up to questions regarding at least our audit plan and our required communications to you before I turn it over to Kevin.
Betty.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Paul. First, I just want to thank the team. I think the communication really throughout the process, but certainly at this stage, is really valuable. And as a newer member of this committee, I really appreciated the dialogue that we had this week. A couple of thoughts I just wanted to share with the committee members. And I know we always talk about our fiduciary responsibility, mostly from an investment perspective, but I also wanted to just kind of put before us our fiduciary responsibility relative to an audit perspective, and kind of the question is, what's the appropriate, I guess, degree of oversight by this committee of management with respect to internal controls? And I know that's something that is the crux of what you look at, but in terms of committee members and the committee, I'm just trying to get a sense of that, because we oftentimes do talk about our fiduciary responsibility mostly on the investment side, but less on the audit side.
We have Bob answer that, or who? Any one of you?
Well, shooting from the hip, you do in fact have a responsibility over that, and this committee, that's one of the more important issues this committee deals with. And fortunately, you're not alone. You have help. You are responsible for engaging an external auditor as part of their audit. They're required to, they don't issue an opinion, but they do take a pretty close look at internal controls. And as you can see, those findings come back. In fact, it was the first thing we did this morning, right? The first substantive thing we did this morning. Not that voting on the quorum and all that's not important, but the real business started right there, right? It's right up front. It's important to see what the findings were, keep track of how they're going. So it is right up in the front. And then next you have internal audit. That's your eyes and ears into the organization. Sure, internal audit works for the organization, swims in that sea. You have to keep that in mind. Nonetheless, they are your apparatus for ensuring some level of oversight and auditing within the organization. I mean, they're accountable to you. And then, for better or worse, you hired me. And my job is to work as a sort of go-between to maybe help with complex terminology or complex concepts and assist the board in weighing those and helping to ask the right questions. And so I don't often talk with every member of the board, but I'm often talking with Director of Audit Services. I'm often talking with the auditors, and I'm very often talking with the chairman. So you're not alone. Yes, you have that obligation, Ms. Controller, absolutely. But you're not alone in executing those duties and obligations. And if you had questions on, are you doing enough? Boy, that's the question, isn't it? Right? There's the heart of it. And you don't want to overinvest because then you're taking tension away from things, right? But at the same time, you need to make sure that you're addressing the things that need to be. And that's really hard. And so what you do is exactly what you did. You ask the question. You ask the question of your auditors, you ask the question of your internal auditors, and you ask the question of me. So you're doing the right thing. And if you don't get a satisfactory answer, go back and ask again.
I really wanted to just identify the various mechanisms that we have to really bring forward issues when we do see them. So this is very helpful.
Yes, Ms. Lee, in our very next agenda item, we're going to touch upon this issue and the importance of the committee's oversight role, particularly with regards to independence of their external financial statement auditor. And that is a key thing for the committee to really monitor. And we have some specific ideas that we're going to talk about on implementing some measures in order to assist with that in our very next agenda item.
Thank you. Thank you. And then my second question relates to, I think, probably something that we're seeing a lot more of in public audits, and that's the role that succession planning plays in either presenting new types of exposure or potential risk. And is that going to be a subject that you'll kind of keep in mind as you're taking a look at some of the internal?
Yeah, so Controller Yee, I would tell you that as it relates to succession planning, and Jack's, I think, sitting behind me, so he knows that we've asked these questions, but primarily when we met with Jack, we have talked to him about all of the key personnel and executive leadership, and specifically about succession planning and his thoughts on that, and making sure that he understands the importance of the competency of those individuals in those roles, as well as many other roles within the organization. So that is certainly something that we look at when we look at the overall risk to the organization. And our responsibility to communicate that internally if we would have any sort of concern. So what I can tell you is, and at least in those discussions, I feel very satisfied with the responses that we're getting. And we are already seeing some of those transitions since we've been the external auditor. So we feel good about what we've seen to date.
I do have a question. Alexis, you referred to the fact that you look at the Milliman report and that you hire an outside firm to validate the assumptions used. So that's all of the demographic assumptions, the investment assumptions. Is that the whole package that basically you're comfortable with the Milliman report and the assumptions, all the assumptions on which it's based?
I can take this. What I would tell you is that we feel like it's important to pull in our own expert as it relates to the calculation of the total pension liability. Certainly, our responsibility is to make sure that the financial statements are not materially misstated, and the total pension liability would be a key calculation and a significant estimate that's embedded within those financial statements and the disclosures. We certainly do a tremendous amount of procedures as it relates to the completeness and accuracy of the census data, so the inputs that go into that calculation. But to what you're alluding to then, embedded within that are all these significant assumptions, right? So the long-term rate of return assumption, and if the crossover date is met or if it's not met, the mortality assumption. So when you think about things like experience study and how the experience study impacts the mortality assumption, as you look at inflation rates. So we look at all of those significant assumptions as well, and want to make sure that the actuarial standards are being followed, want to make sure the best practices are being followed, and then really evaluate if you deviate from any of those assumptions either way, how does that swing the calculation of that estimate, and could the financial statements be materially misstated? So we do that assessment internally, but then we pull in experts that also have a specialty within the public pension arena, if you will, to those same standards to get their feedback and support in doing that. And ultimately what they do is, as a part of our audit documentation, they actually issue us a letter that really goes through the nature of their review. It's a very collaborative process, so as they identify questions, we'll often pull them into discussions that we have with management if we feel it's necessary.
And just a compliment,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we remember that our own audit staff then hires an audit actuary to every 4 or 5 years to audit our valuation, to fully replicate the valuation. Right. And that's underway now, the bid for that service. So that's still another data point that would hopefully align with their work as well. So, I mean, you're double, triple checking the external auditor, I think, in this process pretty well.
Well, and that's my interest is to make sure we have so many people internally, externally looking at so many of these numbers. And we do a lot of checking. I just want to make sure everybody's coming to kind of a consensus that the numbers make sense, because if there's any time when we get a sense that there's inconsistency, then I think we need to know that. But I think what you're saying is in your process, you have to date at least come to a level of comfort that the material that's being produced by Milliman and by our actuarial staff and all of that is something you feel comfortable with to rely on in developing your financial statements or your audit.
Absolutely.
Good. That's
It's
all.
embedded within our unmodified opinion.
Right.
One item that I will bring up, though, that I didn't speak to initially is we're also required to evaluate management specialists. So in this case, Milliman, and we also evaluate their independence and objectivity as a part of their services that they're providing back to the system as well. So embedded in all those other things I said, we also are performing those procedures because that would be very important based on the service they're providing to management.
Any other questions? Yes. Arena, I'm sorry.
So back to the issue about the assumptions and looking at that. So as you know, tomorrow on the agenda is a consideration of an item to postpone the experience study until next year. So when there's something like that on the agenda, does that then make you say, let's ask some questions about what's might be considered next year rather than this year? Is that part of the consideration you would make about the assumptions and you're being comfortable with?
You must have been in some of our meetings yesterday. Actually, we've already asked those questions, and kind of a next step is to set up a meeting with the external auditors, with our actuarial specialist, with management, with management specialists as well, because we really want to understand not only the delay in the experience study, but more, I think, importantly, what is going to be recommended for that mortality assumption that drives the calculation of the total pension liability, and how is management comfortable with that assumption? How is management specialists comfortable with that assumption? And then more importantly, are we comfortable with that assumption? So I think within that, we certainly want to understand why that experience study is being delayed. But ultimately, our responsibility is to evaluate the assumption that's used. Does that address your question?
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think move on then.
I would like to say that we don't have any new GASB statements that are effective in the upcoming year, but I think that the years of being able to say that have long been gone. In the current year, we have one specific standard that I think is going to have a tremendous impact upon the financial statements. GASB statement number 72, fair value measurement and application. Believe it or not, you guys have been required to carry your investments at fair value for the past 15 years plus. But the GASB was relatively silent as to the definition of what does fair value mean and how do you measure it. So they have issued statement 72 to do exactly that, define what is fair value, how do you determine what fair value is. They have aligned that with the FASB. So that's kind of the most important aspect, is that both the governmental units as well as commercial entities across the country will be playing from the same hand as far as how do we define what fair value is. That's actually a tremendous opportunity or a strength for your management as well, because when FASB 157 was issued several years ago, your staff looked at that, said this makes sense, and really started trying to evaluate many of their hard-to-value assets through a lens of FAS 157. So while a lot of their peers across the country are really struggling with the concepts of GASB 72, your staff is very far ahead of that. So that would be item one, is that it's in alignment with the FASB. The other things that I would stress on it is they've defined fair value based upon an exit price, and they've defined the approaches that you can take in order to determine that fair value. It could be a market approach, an income approach, or a cost approach. But once fair value is determined, it then requires us to disclose those assets in basically four buckets, but you'll hear people refer to them as three buckets. You have level one, which is based upon observable inputs and market price driven without adjustment. So these are your equities, things that you can go to an exchange and see what the price was traded at as of your measurement date or your year end. So you know exactly what that stock traded for. Level two is still observable inputs, but not actively traded. So these are your debt securities. We can see what the interest rates are. We know what yield curves are. We can replicate what the price is. Where it gets a little more confusing or nebulous is down in level three, and these are items that are based upon unobservable inputs. This is going to capture many of your hard-to-value assets, whether it be real estate, private equity, infrastructure, etc. So that's where it's going to really define what are the inputs that management has to go identify and evaluate to determine fair value. Conceptually, I believe that there will be limited change in the fair value that is identified. It's primarily going to be disclosure, but it is not unreasonable to think that there could be some nominal changes in fair value based upon this look or this deep dive into the inputs that drive how the fair value is determined. The fourth category would be what we could refer to as a NAV practical expedient, or a net asset value. So if we can determine that these funds trade or have a net asset value calculated in accordance with GAAP for investment companies, it alleviates some of the pressure to identify specific observable or unobservable inputs. You are allowed to just use the NAV. This is going to be obviously a significant part of our audit process in the upcoming year. It is a very significant aspect of what management is doing over the next 6 months to prepare for year end. I want to stress that although it's very significant, I think that the impact upon your financial position will be nominal. And I would think of it as primarily a disclosure-based statement. But again, I think it's going to provide more clarity and transparency to the users of the financial statements. Having the past experience with FAS 157, I had many board members struggle with the concept of level 1, 2, and 3, and does this mean that these are riskier than others? I caution you to remember that level 1, 2, and 3 means it's the inputs that goes into determining fair value. It's not an assessment of the overall risk of the portfolio. So please don't think of it in those terms. There are other avenues to address risk and reward through your investment portfolio. With that, I think that's a high-level summary of GASB 72, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Joy.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to understand the process a little bit more. So with the new standard, internal management will be developing the system for measuring fair value of our investments based on these new standards, and you will be reviewing those to ensure that they meet the requirement?
So I would say that's a great avenue to say, of the 100 pages in your report that we will present in November, we own 3 pages, our opinion. So management is responsible for everything embedded within their general ledger, the completeness and the accuracy of the numbers, as well as determining fair value. So that's why it is an incredible task set forth for management over the next 6 months based upon the size and scope of their investment portfolio and determining the inputs for each of those securities. We will be testing on a sample basis, much like Alexis described in our audit approach, but we will be verifying that we agree with the inputs, that they were the appropriate inputs that management utilized, that we can replicate those inputs, and that ultimately we agree with the fair value that they assessed. If we don't agree with the fair value, then it would go back to, as Alexis also said, do we believe that to be a material error? So material that we would need to modify our opinion and or have management adjust, which would require them to agree with us that they made a mistake? Or is it of a nominal nature where both management and the auditors believe that the financial statements are still materially correct, but we would present that audit difference to you as part of this presentation? If you remember this past year, we actually had differences in the fair value based upon their measurement in the last audit, but management as well as Crow-Horwath determined that we still believe that the financial statements were prepared in accordance with GAAP and materially correct. So that would not change. Does that answer your question? I think I talked way too long.
No, it did. I wanted to, I think, understand the role that your firm plays in, assessing compliance with or, managing implementation of this new standard as contrasted to internal staff. And then I guess my other question is, how is that being handled internally? Is that something that Robin is, okay.
We actually have a pretty elaborate game plan.
If I could just add, the other thing is that we were thinking that maybe at our next ARM meeting that we would have an educational session about this. So I don't want to stop questions now, but see whether, take the
So maybe just really
sense of the
briefly,
committee
just
as to
how-
whether they'd like to understand this a little bit better. I think it would be important, but I don't want to interrupt the question.
So I think the good news for all of us is that we've been planning for this for a number of years, in fact, 3 or 4, by participating in the actual studies that led up to this statement. So we actually commented on the statement. We participated in a field test for the portion of our portfolio. We had a sense for how much it was going to cost for us to implement the required disclosures, what we would need to do on an ongoing basis to maintain those disclosures in an effective way. We've actually contracted with another CPA firm to help us actually get this up and going. They're on site. We have a plan to actually deploy those disclosures after the assessment that we're doing in our 331 results, so that Crow will have at least visibility into what we've done as they look at their interim processes, so that will give us some feedback in terms of any changes that we need to make in the June 31 preparation. Again, I am actually feeling very confident in our approach. We are working collaboratively with the various investment asset classes. We have access to the information we need to go through and discern the inputs for each and every alternative investment, which is a challenge in and of itself, just based on volume and complexity and the difference in each and every one of those investments. But I feel like we have established the communication and the processes that will allow us to be successful. I think in terms of the nuances or the things that we're wrestling with, just so you know that we are thinking about this carefully, is the definition of a NAV expedient under GAAP versus a level 3 investment. And it's a dialogue we're having both with Deloitte, who is helping us implement this, and with Crow in terms of their perspective. And again, it gets into accounting theory, and we want to make sure that we're all comfortable with where we end up partitioning those things, because I think we will make decisions that put things in one bucket in one situation and in another bucket in another situation. So does that give you enough? And I would like to come back in June, if that's acceptable to the committee, and give you an overview of where we are and what we've done and how we're feeling about the process and the results that we're seeing, if that.
Joy, I think what I would add to maybe what Kevin said more directly to your question about, so what's Crow going to do a little bit differently? So we've always been auditing fair value, right, and issuing our opinion. I think what's different here is that the disclosures are going to be significantly expanded, and management's going to go through a process where they're basically going to level each security, whether the input that's used to determine fair value is a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, or this NAV practical expedient. So we also are opining on the disclosures within the financial statements. So we need to make sure we understand how management's assessed for each of those securities, the inputs that were used to determine fair value, how they depict that within this fair value hierarchy table. And then if the disclosures related to those levels then are appropriate based on the standard, which would be describing those inputs that were used to determine fair value, nature and risk of the investments, and that sort of thing. So, that's where our procedures will change, and a lot of our procedures will be dictated by the process that management goes through to come up with that financial reporting. Does that help at all?
It does, and I do think it would be helpful to have a workshop, because I think that'll help us to review and discuss the audit then in the fall, knowing that there's going to be some new information to review and consider.
Bob, Larry, any comments?
Yeah, just real quick. Thanks, Mr. Chair. So with the education, I think it's a great idea. If I were the board, I'd ask for that. And to make sure that part of it majors on the majors. Weeds are great, but to make sure that you don't get lost in the weeds. So make sure that part of the presentation does what it needs to at the level where you can meet it at its level before you get down into the weeds of us talking about stuff that makes us pretty excited. But maybe is beyond a governance role. Right. Maybe it's just accountants. Another is, I think it's important to point out to the board the difference between asset measurement for performance, right, staff performance, versus GASB's and FASB's current fascination with fair value of the balance sheet. It bugs me. I've never liked it. It disrespects the income statement, but that's a theoretical view. So I think it's important to distinguish, right, the GASB standards versus internal use, because that's very important for your staff. And then it is important to note that it could hit the we don't know where assets are going to be a year from now, right? So it could hit you change the balance sheet, it's going to flow through, it's going to hit other financial statements, it's going to make things look different. How big? We don't know. Right now, maybe not, but in a year, maybe so. It's crazy, right? What's going on out there now. So I think it's important.
Larry.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is I think what's really important here, too, is that as an organization, we don't just accept the general partner's financial statement information. It requires us to really understand those inputs and how the values are determined, and then be able to categorize those for presentation purposes, which I think goes a long ways towards promoting transparency in the valuation process, and then increasing our level of understanding as well, so that we get that information right in our financial statements.
I think having the workshop is a great idea. One of the things that I do think we need to understand, I think Bob Bob sort of touched on it, and I'm not going to ask for any more explanation, but ask for it at the workshop is again making sure that we're using consistent numbers. That on the audit and on Robin's side, we're valuing things the same way that Chris and Deborah are valuing things. So or if not, that we at least understand why not, and we don't need to go into an answer now. We can wait till June because we got a lot of other things on the agenda today. But I think that needs to be part of the discussion.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay. Brenda, anything else on your presentation?
No, if there are no other questions, just again to reiterate what Alexa said, we want this to be a transparent process at any point in time. If you would need clarification, if you would have questions, if you go through the next couple of days and you have concerns, please feel free to reach out to us. We work with management, but we work for you. We are hired by you, and we want to make sure that we're exceeding your expectations with our services. And with that, I appreciate the opportunity. You have a great day.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next item on our agenda is the External Financial Statement Auditor Request for Proposal.
Yes, this is an information item for the committee to provide the status on the request for proposal for a new external financial statement auditor RFP, and also to receive committee input with regards to that RFP. The current contract with Crowe Horwath, who is our external financial statement auditor, expires in December 31st of 2018. So Crowe will complete the audit for this year and then for next year, according to the contract, and then that last year is just a transition services. And knowing that high-quality audits are important to CalSTRS that really maintain public accountability and promote transparency, it's a significant it's important that we get a good, high-quality auditor in to perform this work. And in addition to competency, auditor independence is really one of the most important factors in establishing credibility of the opinion that they give. And audit committee oversight is really a key attribute for maintaining auditor independence. And right now, we're just beginning to develop the RFP. We're trying to be ahead of the curve here. We'd like the input from the committee basically on three concepts or three options that we would like to discuss. First is we have an option that we could extend the existing contract with Crowe beyond the December 2018 time period. This would require that we seek board approval with regards to a non-competitive bid, but it allows us to not go through the RFP process and just extend the contract. The second one is to issue a new RFP where services can begin by the financial statement auditor beginning January 1st, 2018. And this would require us to issue an RFP, receive input from a number of vendors who would be involved in a competitive process, allow us to really evaluate the firms and their fee structures and the services that they provide to the organization. Another option is whether to kind of decrease or increase the length of the contract. The current contract is for a 7-year period. Audit Services in here is recommending issuing a new RFP that allows the current external auditor to participate in the competitive process. And consistent with best practices, we're recommending extending the contract period for a minimum of 10 years rather than the current 7 or plus the transition 8-year period. And then have CalSTRS evaluate whether or not we should require mandatory partner rotation if the subsequent external auditor is selected for the new contract. I discussed in the agenda item kind of the ongoing debate with regards to rotation of the auditors or the partners, but I think that there's some key inputs that I need from the committee in order to really move forward here. And so I would just like to seek your thoughts on with regards to the extending the contract or
Can we hear from Bob? And then it looks like Chris wants to say something. So Maybe we should hear from the two of them and then open it up for discussion. Go ahead, Chris.
Chris Elman, Chief Investment Officer. I just want to come forward and represent the corporate governance side of the discussion. As a member of the staff that uses their services, rotating auditors is awful. It's so much work. It's so hard. I would prefer to stay with the same firm forever. But as a board, we have a very strong stand in corporate governance demanding our corporations rotate their auditors because we think it's healthy. So I just want you to be aware, since Ann is out there pounding on companies demanding they rotate, we need to model the way and show that we follow the same suit. So just think about that when you make your decision about how it pains me to come forward and encourage that, but it is still, I just want you to be aware we are very vocal on the other side as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob, any
And the
thoughts?
debate goes on. You know, I appreciate the fact that he mentioned with regards to the cost and the consideration of auditor rotation. There is a tremendous cost. There's a learning curve that an auditor needs to have. So I think it depends on kind of the frequency of the rotation that you might refer to, and even the PCAOB has, at first they were requiring mandatory auditor rotation, and they've moved more towards partner rotation as a suggestion for cost efficiency and the quality of the audits, and in fact right now they have that whole initiative is kind of on hold with the PCAOB as they continue to study this, and it's been an ongoing topic of discussion for a number of years. I think, there's a difference between a listed company that we're really promoting versus our organization, and I think we need to do what the committee feels is right for our organization. And I appreciate the point of view and the corporate governance perspective. I think it's really important, particularly for listed companies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a fierce debate in the audit industry, particularly around listed companies. And it's really hard to say that either side is right. The evidence of a benefit of rotation is really weak. It really is. And it's more the sort of advocacy group for let's rotate is sort of based on the gut feeling that it seems right. And I can see that. I can see that side. We've had a really hard time, academics, showing that that's the case. And maybe it's because there's a small number of audit firms. Maybe it's because auditing standards are standards, and they standardize things, so you get a lot of the same stuff. We're not sure. But I think it's important to know that the evidence of the benefit or the cost is, quite frankly, weak. We would like to find it, but we can't. It's there. So personally, what do I think? I agree with Director of Audit Services. First off, I support going out for an RFP as opposed to a renewal. I like the idea of keeping people sharp, making them work for it. I support that. But I wouldn't exclude the current auditor. You didn't last time. I wouldn't do that this time. I agree with that recommendation as well. With respect to my opinion, for what it's worth, and it's take it or leave it, but I think the decision to rotate or keep is very individual. I don't think it's one size fits all. I think you look at the pool of potential auditors that could do a good audit with your organization. You think about the costs and complexity to your organization, and you think upon these things carefully. Look, if you're Coca-Cola, you've got everybody wanting to audit you, all kinds of high-quality firms. That's different for a public agency like CalSTRS. This is a world-class organization, and I love working for you. But you do need to know that not everybody wants to audit you, and in fact, very few do. And if you're in the trenches like Larry and I looking at this, you'll see how true that is. And then when it comes to partners, you take Coca-Cola's auditor, they have a lot of really sharp partners that they could rotate through. It's not that big a deal. They're all over the country. But then you look at the firms that audit you and say, wait a minute, just rotate the partner just to say I'm rotating for some maybe ephemeral benefit, and then you lose the talent because you don't know that the next one you're getting is actually any better. They might be, but they might not. See, it's very situational for public sector audits. There aren't nearly as many out there. There aren't nearly as many partners who specialize. There aren't nearly as many firms. It's a small world. And so I understand, I talk with Ann not infrequently about this, about many governance issues. I like talking with her a lot. We don't always see eye to eye. I think the issue between public rotation and public sector rotation are two different things. And I understand playing a leadership role and having an outward following what you're recommending. I get that. But I would urge caution on the board's deliberations on this because they're not exactly comparable. In fact, I think they're pretty different. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So I think, or did you want to add?
If I could just briefly, I think what's really key here is that in the last paragraph of this agenda item, and I think it goes back to your question earlier, Ms. Yee, is with regards to what measures can we put in place to really maintain auditor independence. And there's no law that requires us to rotate auditors or with regards to an audit period, a time period for that contract period. However, there are key things that we can do to help the committee, such as performing a periodic assessment of the audit firm's performance. We can look at the quality of services that they provide, the sufficiency of the firm's resources, the types of communications and interactions that they have with staff, evaluate their independence, objectivity, and professional skepticism. And so if we have a periodic process in place that allows us to do that, quite frankly, in the contract process, we can rotate firms anytime we feel that is necessary. We always have an out clause. And if we're not getting the services that we need, then we need to make sure that we do. Another thing that we can do is provide a non-audit services kind of a policy statement, if you will, in our charter that defines the type of services that the auditors can and cannot perform. And then in some cases, any type of services or non-audit services that's performed by your external financial statement auditor either requires approval of the audit committee, or maybe there's some threshold that's set like over a certain percentage of contract. But what the committees then require is that at the end of the year, a report that comes to them that says, here's the cost and here's the types of services that were performed by our financial statement auditor. In fact, all external auditors, that we've employed throughout the year. Here's their cost and here's the types of services that they performed. And that increases your fiduciary oversight of ensuring independence of the auditor and sufficiency of the work.
So I think I've got a couple of people in line. I think what we're hearing is that staff would like some guidance on, number one, whether or not to go out for an RFP, which they're recommending doing. Number two, whether or not to entertain Crow as a bidder, which they are recommending. And number three, the concept of a 10-year contract rather than a 7-year contract. Those are the three elements, I think. Is that right? And then, in addition, Larry has suggested in the last paragraph of his report some oversight procedures that he would be bringing back to the committee and perhaps establishing some specific policies for some kind of oversight, in part to address the question of if we continue with the same auditor, that we've got some feedback. So, people can ask any questions they want, but at the end of this agenda item, we need to come to some consensus. It's not an action item. We're not going to take a vote, but I think we just want to get some sense that we're
General
comfortable with the
direction
direction so with that, Christina.
So from the treasurer's office, the request would be to issue a new RFP and allow Crow to participate. With respect to 10 versus 7, the treasurer has said many times in many places, reflecting what you preach, and so that's an important aspect in in determining what the length of the contract would be is what are we saying to those folks? You know, the doors that Anne is knocking on, and what are we doing here as a board ourselves? So I'd like to hear more from the rest of the committee before I say anything more about that.
Betty?
Thanks, Paul. I also agree with the recommendation of issuing a new RFP and allowing Crow to participate in the competitive process. I don't know if there are really compelling arguments about a contract term exceeding 10 years. I don't know what benefit we would gain from that, and maybe there's some perspective about that we can hear about. With respect to the some of the measures to really ensure auditor independence that Larry's provided, I guess regardless of what we do, I would hope that we would have these mechanisms in place and really have this be a very clear, transparent process that this committee can expect to be engaged in on a regular basis. So I like that. I think the arguments are compelling with respect to probably how limited the universe is of who we would see proposals from. But I do think we should have a policy about auditor independence, and if it is going to be such that our options are limited with respect to compelling a firm to rotate partners, at a minimum, I think these measures ought to be in place that the committee can expect to engage.
Larry or Bob, any thoughts on the 7 versus 10 in terms of what is kind of common practice now? Or best practice?
So it's all over the place. But as Larry pointed out, something important to know. In one sense, you can view these as a series of one-year contracts, right? There's no guarantee. Whatever number you put there, it's a little arbitrary because there's no guarantee. If there's an out clause, my understanding is there's an out clause, and after 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, if you're not getting the audit you think you need, you get a new auditor. So this isn't locking you in to anything. So in that sense, when looked at it through that lens, I think what you need to say is, all right, where are sort of industry practices heading? And, you know, right after Sarbanes-Oxley, everybody got really nervous, right? Everybody was into doing lots of things. And as Larry has said, even the professional standard setters, the PCAOB that's a governmental organization, right? The Public Accounting Oversight Board. They're sort of backing away from some of this because it's a pendulum, and sometimes the pendulum can swing both ways. So the question is, am I comfortable with a 10-year contract? Yes, but only because I know it's really strung together a series of one-year contracts. And with oversight, and also I think the board is maybe, you know, I'm sure Larry said it, I'm sure you heard it, but I want to emphasize this again. What else does your auditor do for you? That's where you can get in trouble, is when an auditor becomes more of a business partner instead of staying sharp and frosty for you. And so those things matter more to me. The auditor's independence, the veracity of their work, that matters so much more to me than a time limit you put on how long the contract is. So I look past that. 10 years sounds great to me. I don't see anything that's wrong with it. But I'd insist on oversight. I'd insist on board review, careful review of non-audit work or audit-related work. And then the 1 year opt-out. That's what matters to me.
Chris, not to put you on the spot, but what would Ann say to that? In answer to Christina's question that, you know, we should preach what we say. We should do what we preach, I guess.
Yeah. No, you know, I think Ann's view is it's the leadership position. It makes it harder when we go into companies. Not all of them take the time to look at what we're doing, but they do throw it back. It's always, you know, the pot calling the kettle black, looking in the mirror. It's a hard balance. We're in a different market. I totally agree with that. You know, I wear, like I said, I wear both hats, so I see Ann's side of it. As close as we can practice what we preach helps give us authenticity in our message.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think I haven't gotten a sense that there's anybody in the committee that's got a strong concern about the direction that we would be going. So unless I hear that, I think greatly appreciated that this was brought to us. Good discussion, really good discussion, and look forward to that oversight work, which I think is completely warranted. I think, Jack, did you have?
I just want to make sure also we didn't talk about Larry's explicitly, but it was my assumption that you would do the actual selection like you did last time, where the committee itself would interview the bidders. That's when you and I discussed that, versus the other approach where you've had like one or two board members sit with other staff members. I assume this would be a full board decision, full committee decision without staff in that voting process. Is that the way you're seeing it?
I think that would be the way I would see it.
Yeah,
That
because we need to
would
build that
certainly,
into the RFP. There's our process as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is that good?
Yeah, I mean, we may. I don't know whether in the selection process, sometimes we've had, you know, a select group of board members who help to winnow things down.
Yes.
But then the interview is with the full board. We may need that. I don't know. When would this RFP go out?
Probably not for another 6 months or so. We're just in the very preliminary stages of
So
organizing.
we still
it.
have time to discuss
Yes.
the selection process, but I certainly think it's a full committee decision. Yes. Okay, great. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you very much.